Hi everyone! Today we're going to talk about art before history. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? These are three of the most universal questions that we ask as humans, and they relate to the nature of the human condition and to our conception of time. Art helps us answer these questions, but it also raises the question of why people created art in the first place. We're going to go back in time today to prehistory, a time before the invention of writing, to the Stone Age. The Stone Age is divided into three major periods: the Paleolithic, meaning the Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, meaning the Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic, meaning the New Stone Age. The word Stone Age refers to the fact that people in these times used stone as their major source for tools and weapons. And as technology will develop over time, we'll see that people will start to use metal instead of stone, and that will bring us into the Bronze Age. We know from archaeological evidence that humans in this time, Homo sapiens, or the wise man, were very culturally complex people. They originated from Africa about 30,000, well, more than 30,000 years ago, but they started to create art around 30,000 BC. They were a community of hunter-gatherers, and they lived in clusters together at cave entrances under shelters that they made of animal skin, plant fibers, bone, and stone. And every one of their houses had a hearth where they would gather to keep warm, and this would be the center of their home. They had a really sophisticated artistic culture that we'll look at today, and it suggests to us that they had the ability of language and that they had an intense history of their traditions and their beliefs that they passed down probably orally, and they probably used art as a tool to communicate their beliefs and their ideals. What we're looking at on this slide in terms of the map is a map of prehistoric sites in Western Europe. And Western Europe is the place that we'll actually be focusing on for the majority of this class because this is a Western art history class. So in this course, we won't be looking at the prehistoric sites that people have found in Africa, for instance, even though this is the birthplace of artistic expression. So we can make inferences about Paleolithic religion through archaeological finds. We can also make inferences about social status. And what we're looking at here are the corpses of two murdered women. They are shown in this reconstruction in a fetal position, which is how Paleolithic people would bury their dead. And not unlike most Paleolithic people, they are buried with their jewelry. Jewelry was a luxury item. These jewels in particular are made of shells, and you would have to be able to walk to the shore or trade with someone who had shells or buy these shells in order to make something like this. So this is considered a very luxurious item. Their burial also gives us a sense that the Paleolithic people believed in the afterlife, because they are often buried facing toward the rising sun, as if they are going to be resurrected. And this gives us a sense that they will be answering the question, where are we going, through their funerary rites. The Paleolithic people often sprinkled red ochre, which is a natural earth pigment, onto the corpses of the people they buried. And this might be an indicator of blood or some sort of burial practice that they instituted. We see it with this infant burial on the right. Infant burials were starting to come into fruition around this time. It was a practice that was increasingly common, and it wasn't unusual for people to start burying their children and their infants as they buried their adults, as we see here. We also see that by the Mesolithic period, interhuman violence will be on the rise. So the reason that these two women on the left were buried actually is because they were murdered. The one woman in this image on the left was shot through the eye and killed with 7 blows of blunt force trauma, and we know this because archaeologists have examined her body for her cause of death. And her friend was also murdered. This might have been because they were coastal people, and as people needed access to the coast, they would engage in warfare, so it would just increase the violence because everyone needs access to the sea and to the resources that the sea can bring. There was an archaeologist and a professor named R.J.C. Atkinson who famously wrote that the raw material of prehistory is not men but things. This is an important concept for us to think about as we continue through this lecture, because we have this romantic notion of prehistory, and we wish that we could speak to the people that lived in this time and really understand their culture and their way of life, but we can't speak to them because they're not here. We have to use the things that they have left behind as tools to go back to the men who made these things so that we can build upon all of the things that we found to create a complete picture of Paleolithic life. And that's what I hope to do with this lecture, is by the end of it, I hope that you will have an idea of what scholars think are the prevailing beliefs of prehistoric people. The other thing that I want to point out with this part of the lecture before we start looking at Paleolithic art is that our conception of art is largely modern. So we tend to think of art as something beautiful that doesn't necessarily have to have a function. This is something that came into fruition in the 19th century with the art for art's sake movement, and it's continued into this day. This wasn't something that the Paleolithic people understood. For them, art always had a function and was related to a purpose that they had set forth for that art object when they created it. Now I want to move on and talk about Paleolithic art in Western Europe. The first image we'll look at is the Lion Man, and this was a statue found and made in Germany. And scholars aren't sure if this man is an actual man with a lion head, or if he's a shaman that is wearing some sort of lion mask as an act of ritual performance, or if this is an image of some sort of mythical creature that these Paleolithic people believed in. What we do know is that the creation of this object was not something that was taken lightly. The sculptor had to actually cut ivory from a mammoth at the base where it met the mammoth's body, and then he had to polish the ivory and cut it down to the size that he wanted it, and then he had to actually go through the process of carving the ivory. So he spent a lot of time and effort in just doing that, and that was something that would have taken hours to do. And take a close look at this object and think about what you think this might represent. We aren't sure if he is actually a lion per se, or if it's just a feline. And the truth is that we probably won't ever know. So I hope you have had a chance in my little pause there to consider what you think to be true about this image. This is the famous Venus of Willendorf. This is the typical prehistoric art object that comes into mind when people talk about prehistoric art. The reason for that is because she is so unidentifiable. She's made up of a series of bulbous ovals, and the identifying features of her face have been masked by what scholars have found to be a carved hat on the top of her head. Her breasts and her midsection are emphasized, so her role as a female, as someone who can reproduce, are emphasized, and all other aspects of her not related to gender are not emphasized. So we don't see very much of her hands, although they do exist. Her hands and arms are actually resting on her very large breasts here, if you follow this line. And she doesn't have any feet. And like I said, she doesn't have a face. These are all features that everybody has. Everyone has arms, legs, and feet, but females have this unique ability to reproduce, and that is what the sculptor has emphasized. You'll notice on the slide description that she's just over 4 inches tall. That means that she was meant to be held in your hand. She's small enough to be carried with you. It's possible that she was a fertility goddess, that she was designed to be a ritual object that you could pray to ensure a successful harvest, perhaps, or to ensure your own personal human fertility. We just don't know. It could be that she is a combination of both of these things. She could be an all-encompassing Mother Earth goddess, as well as someone that you would believe to help you in your quest for children. This is her from all sides, and what we notice when we look at this image is that more attention is paid to the front of the image than her at all sides. We don't see the sculptor spending a lot of time rendering her back, for instance, or rendering the back of her body or the sides of her body. He's really focused on what the profile is, what she looks like when she's at the front, and then when you turn her to the side, and what that line is when you follow her body. Some scholars think that because of her profile, which is the way her body looks when you follow it down like that she might actually be pregnant. And this, if this is the case, would fit with the idea that she's a fertility goddess. It also fits with other prehistoric Venuses that have been found, where they are depicted as pregnant, actually pregnant, or in the act of giving birth. And we'll look at an example of that later today. I want you to sort of maybe pause this video and look at this image and think about why you think this image is the quintessential prehistoric art image that comes to mind when people think about prehistoric art. The other kinds of images that come to mind are cave paintings, but when we think about prehistoric sculpture, this is the crowning achievement, the Michelangelo of prehistoric sculpture. And think about why you think that is. I don't have an answer for you, but these are the kinds of questions that we should be thinking about generally, what our own response is when we see artworks like this, and think about how modern society and scholars have interpreted them over the years. This is the Venus of Willendorf in comparison to the Kotensky Venus. Now, you'll notice that she's not unlike this other Venus on the left, which is from Russia. She's actually very similar. The Venus of Willendorf is stone. The Kostenki Venus on the left is ivory. So we have different materials, but the artist is actually showing the Venus with a similar type of hat or maybe braiding. And he's showing her with this very elaborate sort of jewelry that scholars think is either some sort of necklace that emphasizes the breast when you put it on and goes over your arms. And she's also pregnant as well. If we turned her in profile, she would have that same jetted out belly that the Venus of Willendorf has. And the reason I'm showing this to you, even though it is not in Western Europe, is because I want you to at least be aware that these kinds of images, these kinds of Venuses are being created throughout the world, no matter where you are. So there is a similarity in culture between all of these prehistoric people that we do see in human history. Venuses aren't only created in the round, that means things that we can pick up and hold and see all sides of. They're also shown in relief like we see here. Relief is when an image is carved away from the background of the stone. This is the La Selle Venus, and she is a woman who is holding a bison horn. If you look closely at her, you'll notice that, like the Venus of Willendorf, she doesn't really have a face, but this stone is in such bad shape here that perhaps originally she did have some sort of facial features that we just now cannot see. She also has her breasts and her midsection and pelvic area emphasized, as well as her hips, like the Venus of Willendorf. Her hips are very large, allowing for, maximum childbirth capability, and she's holding a bison horn, which might mean that she is some sort of goddess, or she is a woman preparing to give birth, or a woman who has just given birth, who is doing some sort of ritual ceremony. Bison were very important to prehistoric people, especially in a religious context, so it's possible that this image was religious in purpose at some point. Although we just don't know, and scholars are debating what that horn means. It's a very deliberate choice that is still very mysterious after all these years. This is the Dame de Bois-en-Poix, and here she is. She's very tiny. She's in the round like the Venus of Willendorf. She's only 1¼ inch tall, so she's maybe, that big. That big. And she's got this really beautiful hair coming down her body. This is either braids or curls. And she has a very long feminine neck. She also has deep set eyes and a nice oval face with a prominent jawline. Scholars aren't sure, like so many things, this is something you'll hear me say a lot. They aren't sure what this was used for or who this is. She is certainly more of a portrait, if we can use that word, than the Venus of Willendorf, because she does have a face. In fact, all she is a face. And that leads some scholars to believe that this might be an important woman in the prehistoric society, or she might be a goddess of some sort, or she could be, something that someone was buried with. We just aren't sure. And here's a comparison. You can see the drastic difference between these two sculptures, both women, but we can tell they're women in very different ways. We know the Venus of Willendorf is a woman because her forms are very exaggerated and emphasized. With the lady on the left, we know that she is a woman because she has these very soft feminine features, and what scholars think is probably hair or braids or curls of some kind. It could also be some sort of fancy headdress that comes down her head and is some sort of decorative item. And again, this is an ivory image on the left, so this is something that would have been from a mammoth tusk that would have had to have been cut from the mammoth or just found if it had fallen off, and then cut to size and carved. So a lot of effort goes into making something like this. These are 2 bison from a cave in France, and prehistoric sculptors didn't only make Venuses, even though that's all we've seen so far. They also made a lot of different kinds of animals. We have representations in painting and sculpture of birds and fish and rhinoceros and panthers and lions, bears, lots and lots and lots of different kinds of animals from different levels of the food chain. These bison, though, seem to be especially important to prehistoric people because they are found just all over the prehistoric world. So these bison, the sculptor made them out of clay. And you'll notice that they're set into the rock, so the rock behind them is actually supporting them. The clay was brought to this part of the cave by the sculptor from another location, so effort goes into gathering this great amount of clay and bringing it to this part of the cave. These bison are pretty big to be clay sculptures. They're about 2 feet long each. And if you've ever worked with clay, you'll know that that can be quite a lot to work with. He also took a lot of time to render their features. So a lot of detail is paid to making sure they have eyes and defined nostrils, a clearly defined mouth, clearly defined mane and hairs on the face, both of them. He probably made these marks with his hands or with some sort of sharp tool like a burin. Scholars don't know why, again, these bison were made. They are probably some sort of religious symbolism, but the sculptor left them in this part of the cave and they cracked because this part of the cave did not have any moisture coming in. It was just completely dry. So once the clay dried out, just probably within a few days, these bison got cracks in them. And that's why they are still cracked today. We also see that sculptors pay attention to their materials. So this bison has he's on a rock, and the sculptor has followed the form of the rock to create this image of this bison. And he has his head turned. This is something that is very typical of prehistoric art, especially in renderings of animals, where the head will be turned around the body 180 degrees in what we call twisted perspective, where if this was a realistic image, hypothetically he would be completely in profile and we would only see half of his face, but it would be facing to the left, not to the right around his body like it is here. This is another example of the sculptor taking a lot of care with this image. Taking care to render the hairs on the face and the mouth and the eyes and the horn and the different textures of those things. It's interesting that this bison in particular was a spear thrower fragment. So in this time, prehistoric people would have spears and they would notch the spear into a stick, and then they would use that as leverage to be able to throw the spear farther than they would be able to before. And a lot of times these spearheaders like this one were animal imagery, and we'll look at another example of one a little bit later. This could be a representation then of the family's symbol. Perhaps the family had the symbol of the bison, or perhaps this is identifying the sculptor to, or the warrior to whom the spear belonged. And that way they could return it once they had returned from the hunt. Or it could be, you know, that it was part of some sort of special hunt, that this was not a spearheader that was used every day, that it was used on specific occasions, and that could be true because of how much time and effort went into making this. So you can pick the opinion that you think. We're going to move on to cave painting. And with cave painting, what we see is that these paintings are made over a period of centuries. And to get an idea of the vastness of the caves and just their, their magnitude, I encourage you to watch The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which focuses on the Chauvet caves in France. It's available on Netflix and to rent on Amazon Instant Video. And it's a really good movie, not very long, but pay attention to the visuals in the film if you do watch it, so that you can get a sense of the magnitude of these caves and what it's like to move through them. So cave painting. So caves, the first thing I want to say about them is that they aren't houses. People actually lived outside of caves in places made of various organic materials, as I mentioned earlier. Caves were probably places where communities strengthened their social bond and where probably initiation rites and other ritualistic rites were performed. Over 200 sites with cave paintings have been found in Western Europe, and this is actually considered a rare find because even though there's 200 of them, these paintings were made over a period of 10,000 to 20,000 years. So they've lasted for generations in these caves, and generation after generation has gone in and added to what their ancestors have placed before them. Paintings like the one on the top here were made possible by lighting the caves, because obviously in a cave there's no light unless there's some sort of hole in the cave. But artists used stone lamps in order to be able to see what they were actually doing. And an example of that is this lamp from your textbook from Lascaux here. And it has these decorative markings on the base of it that scholars aren't too sure what they mean. The other thing that we need to keep in mind about caves is that dead cavemen don't tell tales. We don't know the purpose of these cave paintings, but we can make educated guesses as to what their meaning is. So I mentioned initiation rituals a little bit earlier. These could have been a place where young hunters would come and become initiated into the society once they had perhaps killed their first animal, or perhaps you would do the initiation ceremony before you were allowed to go hunt. They could also be places where shamans, that is sort of religious priest types, would go and speak to animal spirits in these caves. There's a suggestion by an archaeologist that says that artists actually created these animals with the idea that their spirits lived inside them, and shamans could communicate with them, with the spirit of nature that was in them, to try to ensure good things for the people of the tribe or the community. And then finally, the other major thing that these cave paintings might represent is killing an effigy. Because what we see with a lot of paintings is they will have marks in them, physical marks, from where spears have hit them in the stone. And sometimes there's physical marks with red ochre or pigment dripping down from the mark as if it's blood. Other times there's spear marks or actual spears painted into the body of the animal, suggesting that it has been killed in what we call effigy. So it is a stand-in for the animal itself, and if they spear it in the cave, if they kill it in the cave, then when they go out to hunt, they will have a successful hunt. And this is one of the popular possible theories as to what these cave paintings could have been used for. One of the earliest caves that was found was the Altamira cave, and it was found by a man and his daughter. And what happened was the daughter she found the cave and she went into it, and she looked up and she was able to see these incredible paintings that we're looking at here. She was a very small person, maybe 9 years old, and her father had a lot of trouble getting into the cave to actually see what she saw, because he was an adult and much larger. And this is an interesting tidbit because what scholars have found after this, after hearing this story, was that a lot of these caves have footprints in them, and the footprints are the size of children's footprints or women's footprints. So perhaps, when I and other scholars refer to the artist or sculptor as he, the artist or sculptor might have been a woman, and we just don't know. Once this cave was found in the 1800s, the scientific community didn't actually believe the man and his daughter. They thought these paintings were a hoax. They thought there was no way that prehistoric people could make something so monumental so early in history. And it wasn't until the 20th century that their theories were really validated, because by this point people had found more cave paintings, and this enabled them to believe in what the man had said all along, which was that these are early cave paintings here in Spain, and you have to believe me. But eventually, they did believe him. Now, take a look at these bison because they don't look exactly right. They are floating in space, which is not what you would think of an animal or a representation of an animal. There's no common ground line for these animals. They're, all jumbled, and curled up, and maybe the curling up refers to them being dead or asleep, and we just don't know. It could also be that maybe this is some sort of celestial representation because they are so defiant of gravity. Whatever the reason, though, we do know that these paintings did mean something to the people that made them, and we do know that these paintings were made over a long period of time, over centuries, and added on to by people over time. Other kinds of paintings that we see in caves are ones with handprints like this one, and ones with lots of spots on them also like this one. So this is a spotted horse with negative hand imprints, which means that you would put your hand on the wall and then blow the pigment around your hand, and what you see here would be the result. There's also positive handprints where you can dip your hand in something and dab that on the wall and your hand will be filled in. Scholars aren't sure what these handprints are. They could be the handprints of important members of the community. So perhaps this horse was painted and the community was about to go on the hunt, and then members of the community put their hands on the image as if they were blessing it. They could be the signature of the artist or artists that created this. And again, we're not sure. There's one theory that says that maybe they're the handprints of influential women in the society, so that now we have, the female touch on the artistic, spiritual conglomerate that's happening in this cave. And as far as the spots' meanings, we're not sure why the horse is totally spotted and why directly above his head here and then below his head he has these spots that seem to delineate, the bottom of his face. One thing that you might notice if you're looking here is that the form of the horse follows the form of the rock, and this is something that's very, very common in cave paintings throughout Western Europe. The artist will use the form of the rock or the object, whether it's an antler or an ivory tusk, to paint the object into that form and follow it so that it's organic to the shape already. The other thing that's interesting about this cave in particular is that the animals are shown on different surfaces. So the horses with the hands are painted on concave surfaces, and bison and cattle only appear on convex surfaces. And no one knows why, and that's just something that is a strange, fact that probably lends credence to the idea that these are ritualistic in some way. We're going to talk about one of the most famous caves in all of prehistory, Lascaux. And this is one of the galleries in the cave to try to give you a sense of what it is like to move through this space, because the pictures that I've shown you so far are zoomed in and don't give you a sense that when you're looking at these, you are in a cave. Or with the Altamira cave, with the ones that the little girl found, they're on the ceiling, and in the image that I showed, you can't, you would never be able to tell that to see them, you would have to be looking up like that. So this image does give a good sense to what it's like to be in these caves and what it's like to experience these images in their natural environment. A lot of these caves, like Lascaux, are no longer open to the public because the atmosphere, once these caves were opened, made it so that the paintings inside deteriorated over time. And the deterioration just kept getting worse as people were allowed in to see these things. So a lot of these caves aren't open to the public, and Lascaux is one of them. So as you move through the cave, through galleries like the one we just saw, you eventually arrive at the Hall of the Bulls, which is this sort of open area in the cave, and we can see here that many different kinds of animals are shown in this portion of the cave. They are all painted in a different style, which suggests that they are painted at different times. So if we look on the far right, the largest bull, which is this one, it's over 11.5 feet long, which is massive. But he's actually overlapping another animal here and another animal here. And that, follows suit that this was painted after what we see here, because he's painted it on top of something else. The same goes for the images here. Some of them are overlapping others, and some of them are painted in completely different styles. For instance, this bull here is painted in outline, so he just has this black that delineates his body, whereas this animal here is actually colored in, and we don't know why that is. Why did this animal get an outline and an infill when this bison or bull only got an outline, and this animal here didn't get an outline but he got colored in? And we just don't know what those choices mean or if they mean anything. Similarly, some animals are just completely in black silhouette, and we see a few of those here. Now, if you step back and look at this image, what is the impression that you get? Do you get the sense that these animals are rushing, like they're a herd, like the scene in The Lion King when all the animals are rushing to get away from the lions? Is it like that? Because if so, this is very much a modern conception, and it's certainly the impression I got when I first saw this image years ago. But this is, modern, and this is not what people in prehistoric times would have experienced. This was something that was built onto over time. So it could have started out, let's say, with this animal here, and then artists slowly painted on top of that and added to it over time, perhaps in some sort of initiation rite. Perhaps if you had a successful hunt, you would come in and add to the wall. We just don't know. And that's what makes this image so famous when we talk about prehistoric art, because it's so mysterious, and there's so many questions with it, and we just don't know the answers to those questions. This is what the Hall of the Bulls looks like when you are standing. Once you've gone through the gallery and you reach the Hall of the Bulls, this is what it looks like. So you can see that some parts of it just aren't in good condition. There was a large animal shown here that we can only see his face now. And he's kind of like the godfather of all the animals. He looks like he was quite large. And you get a sense too when you see this image of the context of this. So here we see how far back the Hall of the Bulls goes, and we see that the animals are, in a sense, they are rushing from this site in the cave and they're coming this way. But by contrast, we have the bull, and he fits very, very well into his space. He fits very well into this box here that was open and, you know, partially not open because it was painted over, but that was partially open, and the artist saw this and thought this would be the perfect place to paint this bull. The final thing I want to say about this image is that a lot of the animals are shown in what we call twisted perspective, which means that if this bull was shown with real perspective, he would be in profile, so we would only see one horn and then the side of his face. But the artist has twisted nature to show us that he has two horns so that perhaps we can better identify what kind of animal this is. Or perhaps the two horns are, you know, also important in the prehistoric man's conception of these animals, and by extension, any spiritual purpose that they might have served. This image is the rhinoceros, wounded man, and disemboweled bison. This image is also from Lascaux. It is from the deepest, darkest, hardest to reach area of the cave known as the well. And it is also the only figural representation of a person in the cave. So I'm going to pause for a minute and let you look at this and think about what you see happening. The question that I want you to think about is this a narrative? Meaning, does this painting tell a story? And if so, what is the story that it communicates to you? So scholars think that what we're looking at is a rhino here who has encountered this bison here and this wounded man here. We don't know the order of these events. So it could be that this man has wounded or disemboweled this bison. We see his intestines coming out here. We also see that he is wounded with a spear right through those intestines. And there's another spear lying by the man's feet. And there is a much more fancy spear with a bird finial on it by his hand. The bison is twisting and turning as if he's, you know, writhing in pain from being stabbed, and his head is down. Perhaps he was charging at this man after he got injured, and that's why his horns are pointing down and pointing at this man's chest. The man seems to be wearing a bird head on his head, a bird mask on his head, because here's his little eye, and then here these two lines have been interpreted as beaks, and hopefully you can see that okay. He's also kind of flailing his arms out as if, not as if he's flying, but as if he's in some sort of pain, or as if he's falling backward in some way. You might be wondering why I keep calling him a man when he is very clearly a stick figure. Scholars have interpreted this fine work of art here to be his genitalia, specifically his erect genitalia. So they might think, or some scholars think that some scholars think that he is involved in some sort of ritual killing, and that he might have failed in that killing because he himself has become wounded, or that this is some sort of representation of some, some success in the hunt in some way, some sort of spiritual success. We'll get back to this bird finial in a minute. The other possibility with this narrative is that the rhino has come through and injured the bison and also the man, and that both of these creatures have fallen prey to a much bigger and scarier creature. And if that's the case, then this would potentially be some sort of warning image as to what you should fear. And what you should fear is the thing that can kill you and kill the thing that you like to eat, which is this rhino here. It's much more dangerous than the thing that you fear in your normal life, which is the bison. Now, to get back to the birds, birds were often considered to be couriers of the heavens, and they were, in prehistoric times, they had this very specific connotation attached to them where they were like ushers into the afterlife. And that might be related to what we're looking at, where this injured man who is wearing this bird mask and has this bird staff with a bird finial on the top of it has performed some sort of ritual rite before the hunt or during the hunt, and he has ended up dying. But it's a sort of circle of life type thing where he would wear this because he's going to take a life, which is the life of the animal, and in that sense he is like some sort of grim reaper or god of death or taker of life. And that could be one reason for the bird imagery. The other reason for the bird imagery could be that people in these times were, or in this culture, this community I should say specifically, were buried with perhaps some sort of bird mask in their graves, and then that might make it so that this could be an image of someone who has died in the community in some sort of animal attack. And the truth is, again, we just don't know. The final thing about this image is, well, there's lots more I could say, but what I want to end with is the philosopher Georges Bataille, who argued that man became terrified of death. As humanity evolved, he became terrified of death and began to have a reverent respect for it. And in the process, he began to respect those things that could bring death to him. So he argues that what we're looking at here is an image of profound respect where the artist is acutely aware of the danger that he faces in his everyday life, just trying to survive. And he fears these animals so much that he is paying homage to that by showing them, in a very naturalistic light, and paying homage and demonstrating an awareness of the fact that these animals hold this power over life and death. By extension, Mother Nature holds this power over life and death of prehistoric man, and this was a sense of great anxiety for prehistoric man. So when he's painting cave paintings generally, he's doing so because he is in awe of these things that have so great power over him. And we'll return to this image a couple more times throughout this week as we continue to talk about prehistoric art. This is an image to show you that the finial that he's holding actually has basis in historical fact, in archaeological finding. So this finial that in particular has a bird on the end of it, but scholars have found similar ones. For instance, this is a spear thrower with a doe, and then here is what scholars think is either feces or or some sort of fertilizer. And then on top of, it's hard to see, but on top of that are two birds that are kind of pecking at it. And scholars think that either this is an image of this doe being born, or it's an image of this doe just in nature, and these birds next to the doe kind of pecking at the manure and symbolizing regrowth and life, because plant life will eventually come out of this fertilizer here. So in any case, this was a spear thrower like the one that we saw earlier, carved out of the deer antler. This one is also carved antler, although what we're looking at is a reconstruction of it. Now, because the original is too fragile, so they put a reconstruction on display. Now the spear itself, I like this because you'll be able to see it, would have gone into this notch between the doe's legs and arms, and then the person who was hunting would be able to use that as leverage to throw it. So it's a fancy object, meant to aid you in hunting and become a better hunter. Now scholars aren't sure if this was the object of a whole family, and this was their spear thrower that identified them as the family that killed the animal, or if it's the object of one person. So perhaps everyone in this community had their own spear thrower, and perhaps the image on the spear thrower related to their name or what they specialized in killing. Another theory is that the image on the spear thrower symbolizes what the spear was used to kill. So I think personally it would be hard to kill a bird, for instance, with a spear, but maybe it's not impossible. It would be easier though to kill a doe with a spear. So that theory is definitely plausible. Again, this is one of those things that we just don't know the answer to. I'm going to leave you here now, and in my next video I'll talk about megalithic architecture in Neolithic Europe.